Well, hello, and welcome to a little experiment in, some people would call it crass cross-marketing, but we'd like to think of it as intellectual cross-pollination between Alexander Kolyandr of The Bell and me, Mark Galeotti of In Moscow Shadows. Alexander, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, Mark. I'm Alexander Kolyandr. I'm with CEPA, which is Center for European Policy Analysis, a think tank, and I'm also an author of weekly um, publication in The Bell, which is Russian emigre newspaper, where every week Alexandra Prokopenko and myself write you about ins and outs of the Russian economy, and we are trying to make sense of what's going on there, despite all the panicking reports and boasting statements of the Kremlin.
And I'm Mark Galeotti. I'm an honorary professor at University College London School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And I'm also the person behind the In Moscow Shadows weekly podcast, which is my idiosyncratic and entirely egotistical take on Russian politics, security, and history. And that is also, although that is freely available and it comes out weekly, there is also a series of add-ons available to paying patrons, ranging from the weekly Говорит Moskva press review to others, depending on the level of your patronage. And broadly speaking, I work not on the economy, but on politics. So that's what I'll be talking about. So what we thought we'd do is, given that we're coming up to 4 years from the start of this terrible war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion, we'd basically use this as an opportunity to take stock and then look ahead. And the first kind of issue we wanted to address is the whole question of what have we learned about the Putin system or the Russian system under Putin, because I'm not sure if there's anything called Putinism. And so I'll kick off talking a little bit about politics and security, and then hand over to Alexander to talk about the economy and whatever else he wants to cover. And look, clearly the core motif is the degree to which this is a regime which clearly is becoming increasingly authoritarian, but it is becoming authoritarian under a series of pressures, real and imagined. And that tells us something about Putinism beforehand. It's very easy to talk about Putin as being a tyrant from the first, but he wasn't. This is a man who was trying to find some way of balancing a degree of openness, a degree of freedom, at least because this is a man who'd seen how the Soviet Union devolved into kind of stodgy chaos, while at the same time maintaining his control over the political system and his capacity, therefore, to continue to reward his friends and enjoy a comfortable life himself. So authoritarianism, or the growing authoritarianism, is really a product of pressure and fear. And I think that's a core element, the degree to which actually insecurity is probably one of the most important driving factors of the Putin system. Insecurity actually has some basis. From my point of view, this is a regime which, certainly in terms of its political and security position, is strong but increasingly brittle. There are no immediate challenges. This is not a country which is about to fragment into sub-states. There are no prospects for a military coup or mass protest in the streets or whatever. But instead, what we are getting is an increasing degree, I would say, of disengagement within both the public and also the elite. Of course, everyone in the elite claims to be a loyal supporter of the regime and happily emblazons themselves with a little Z or whatever when necessary. It's not the same as actually being happy with the current status quo. There are a few winners, of course, but there is, I think, I would suggest, an abiding sense of uncertainty, unease, and dissatisfaction about the way things have gone since February 2022. And likewise within the public. Now, again, we're not necessarily going to see this from the kind of more simple opinion polls. This is not an environment that rewards people saying unsafe things. But nonetheless, again, that's just that sense of disquiet, especially as the economy, as we'll hear, starts to get more problematic. So, in many ways, the real threat, I would say, that the regime feels and fears is what we saw with the Prigozhin mutiny from the Wagner mercenary army back in 2023, which is precisely not that people will suddenly flock to try and topple the regime, but that when the regime does face a crisis, some kind of black swan event, they just won't want to actually bother doing anything to support and protect it. Because we saw that time a relative handful of mercenaries spearing towards Moscow, not to topple Putin, but to try and essentially change an internal balance of power. And army, National Guard, all kinds of other forces along the route of march, thinking that they just sit this one out and see what happens. So, an insecure regime. I think the insecurity clearly is part of the reason for the 2022 invasion, increasingly insecure, maybe with some reasons. Alex, what do you think we've learned about Putin's Russia?
Yes, I actually want first to ask you a question because you were observing that from a different point of view. And the question is, since 2022, and I completely agree that the war was started because of the sense of insecurity. And but the question is, do you think in the past 4 years, the overall regime became more stable and flexible? Or more ossified
Mm.
and less responsible to events and headwinds. And I think that I would love to know what you think about that politically, and then we can discuss what happened to the regime economically. Because my sense
Mm.
from the economical point of view and how the government and the Kremlin was dealing with economical challenges makes me think that actually the whole system became a little bit less flexible and a little bit more ossified and a little bit less prepared for whatever life has prepared for the regime and us.
Yeah,
What
I
do
think
you
it's a really
think?
good question. And this is the trouble because, strength and ossification can look very similar from a distance. I mean, I would agree with you. I think we also see this in the political sphere about the ossification. And in some ways, I'd answer it with a metaphor almost, is if you look at what's actually happening in the war. In the war, we are seeing massive Russian tactical level adaptation. At first it was the Ukrainians who very much were sort of pushing the envelope of what can be done, whether it's with drones or other technologies. The Russians, though, learnt their lesson and they catch up. And I'm not saying that they're proving more innovative than the Ukrainians, but certainly that gap has narrowed dramatically. So on the battlefield, in the war zone, we're seeing the Russians actually able to adapt fast. If you look at the top level, though, at the level of doctrine, at the level of overall strategic planning, it's clear that the general staff really hasn't an idea. It doesn't really know what war is going to be like in the future. I mean, nor do any of us. It doesn't really know what kind of a military it will want to build once the war eventually ends. And frankly, it's just therefore sticking to old patterns, in many ways, actually very, very still Soviet patterns. And I think in some ways that's what one can map across to the system. We are seeing areas of innovation and development in terms of whether it's the propaganda, in terms of whether it's trying to create support bases for the regime or whatever. But at a top level, I think there is a degree of paralysis, a degree of ossification, a just degree of just keep things holding them together. Even though in the long term, the clever conservative understands that you reform to preserve. But nonetheless, at the moment, no, I think ossification is dominant. This is the late Brezhnevism stage of Putinism, I'd say.
It's nice you mentioned that because I keep on comparing what's happening to the Russian state and the Russian economy to what I witnessed as a boy in the early 80s or mid 80s. Because what I remember from that time, apart from, lines for food and lack of bananas, is that something happened almost every day. Some technological disasters, sinking ships, falling planes, earthquakes, and Chernobyl. And every time, obviously, it was a huge challenge for the Kremlin for the Soviet authorities. And every time, the reaction was, as I understand it now, expensive, slow, and not entirely perfect. And on top of that, the country was running out of money. So if we move back to what's going on today, From the economic point of view, I think that the system demonstrated an enormous ability to adapt. It showed, well, it basically, it has basically proven to everyone that Russia is not a socialist, communist, or whatever authoritarian economy. It's not a gas station pretending to be a state, as one late Congress senator described it. It is actually a pretty flexible, adaptable, capitalist market economy. And that's what happened to the economy in 2022, 23, 24, to an extent. Because the government allowed economy to prosper in a sense to do, it was kind of a pirate economy. Do whatever you like. There is no law as long as you keep your ship afloat and everyone's happy. We will not charge you or arrest you or do whatever you like. And when the foreigners left Russia, Russia immediately created the system of parallel import, which effectively was free for all, import whatever you like. We will not charge you. We will not bury you under bureaucratic avalanche of papers and laws. Just bring the stuff in. And that actually saved the market. Uh, Sanctions also helped to a certain extent because the Western sanctions actually locked in capital inside the country. So the government and the central bank were not forced to impose capital controls by and large. Well, they did some, but not on the draconian level because part of the job was done by Europe. And secondly, there was no limit on crossing the border because mostly European countries, where the majority of the Russians who wanted to leave the country were aiming to go, didn't want them. So partly these sanctions helped to keep the system going, but partly it was due to enormous professionalism of the Russian financial authorities, be it finance ministry, economy ministry, energy ministry, and especially the central bank. In my view, Elvira Nabiullina is Putin's best weapon and is more important in the battlefield than hundreds of Oreshniks or whatever the name is, because she managed to keep the system afloat without killing it outright. So we saw that for 2 years, Russia adopted this part, open liberal market economy inside the country, and partly it was a textbook Keynesian economy, pumping budget money into the economy and make it grow at whatever speed you can fathom. Obviously, because of many restrictions, part of it was demographical. Russia doesn't have enough people. Partly because of the sanctions, it became extremely expensive and difficult to import, spare parts and new machines. But it all resulted in an overheated economy with high inflation, which the central bank is trying to slow down with exorbitant base rates, which effectively creates a stagflation in the civilian part of the economy, while the military part of economy continues to grow. So after 4 years, we definitely have a two-tier economy in Russia. So if you are employed by a military defense company or get defense contracts from the state, you are in the luck. You can sing and laugh all the way to the bank. If you are in the construction, consumer spending, or even coal production, or metal production, or hotels, for example, then you are in trouble. We ran a small exercise and we just realized that in 4 years, production in four major sectors of the economy where all the defense production is included. It's what's called finished metal produce, it's other machines and parts, it's optics and electronics, and to a certain extent, it's medical equipment and pharmacology. They all grew a lot. The growth for the finished metal parts, that's where you include all your tanks and Kalashnikovs and whatnot, was up by almost 400%, 300 something. But when you look at the overall output of the economy, it was only up by 50%. And in many sectors, the combined output for the past 4 years is actually below that of January 2022. So there is a definite two-tier economy. One of that includes defense production and whatever the state decides to support, and everything else, which is, in effect, the market economy, is not supported by the state, and it doesn't feel so well, which results in an overall slowdown. You see the GDP growth, whatever you think of measuring economics by that, was almost 5% last year. I'm sorry, 2024. I keep on forgetting that we're in 26 now. And it was merely 1% in 25 and will be somewhere around 0 or 0.5 this year. And the government does not expect any pickup of growth until at least 2027. So in a sense, it looks like the Soviet economy. There is a military part of the economy, and there is a production of, how did they call it? Production class B, whatever the consumers wanted to buy. And more or less, that's what's happening. However, on a more granular level, the economy is still very adaptable, and people do adapt. People find ways of, smuggling in whatever the economy needs, and they use cryptocurrency and other ways of paying for import. They created the whole system of shadow fleet, as they created ways of moving millions in and out of the country. And that's more or less what happened to the late Soviet economy, when a whole swathe of shadow economy was simmering under the, gray cover of the Soviet militarized official economy. Because in the Soviet Union, it was still possible to buy a pair of jeans.
Yes, I mean, in many ways, actually, the Soviet system just ensured that Russians would be hyper-capitalists. But obviously, what you've been saying, that begs the question. If we move on to the question of peace, there's peace talks going on at the moment, well, sort of episodic ones. We'll see how they perform. One of the key factors that people are presuming will be driving Russia's willingness or lack of willingness to make any kind of concessions in the name of peace is precisely that whole question of, is Putin going to run out of money to be able to pay for his war?
I think he will not. Well, end of
At all,
story.
ever?
Well, at all ever we can say, because we still assume that he is mortal. It's not given, but the point is, it all depends on how much the Kremlin and Putin himself are willing to tolerate inflation. So let's look at the budget deficit. Because the budget, the state money, is very important for today's Russian economy, because effectively it fuels its growth and production and military spending and everything else. So there are two problems there. On the one hand, the government cannot cut the spending, especially when it comes to the military spending or the social spending, because it's way above their pay grade. It's not for the government to decide. They cannot raise taxes because they've done it in the past 3 years, and the economy is not doing great. And usually, you do not raise taxes when economy is stagnating. And that results in looking into the overall balance, because on top of everything, your, or rather their, income from oil is declining because global oil prices are way less than what they have envisaged, and sanctions do dent into the oil taxes. This is this is not a point for discussion. They do dent into that. And on top of that, if you look at the non-oil revenue of the budget, which now is about 80% of all the budgetary revenue, just to stress it, Russia gets only 20% of its government funds from oil. Everything else comes from the wider economy. But the wider economy, as we've just discussed, is stagnating, which means that taxes, be it VAT, profit tax, or income tax, are not rising either. So you have this disbalance. It ends up with budgetary deficit. Deficit of the budget in the past year was 2.6% of GDP. Pretty small compared to the deficit of, say, France or this country. Just to remind you, we are talking about 5% here and there. Uh, I still think that the real deficit was higher in the past year, and they managed to reach 2.6 only by moving some of the spending to 26. And for 2026, the government expects 1.6% of GDP deficit. But I do not believe they will be able to achieve it. I suppose it will be somewhere around 3%, below 3%, somewhere there. So once again, it's not extremely high, but the problem is, due to the sanctions, Russia is excluded from the international markets. Prior to the invasion of 2022, about 20% of Russian debt was owned by foreigners. Now the government can only rely on the domestic banks. So it asks the banks to buy the government debt, they buy it, then bring it to the central bank, get cash for that, and then use cash to buy more debt. It's kind of a debt inflation spiral, and it's not extremely good for the economy. But by doing that, the government and Putin can get as much money as they want, as long as they tolerate inflation for long enough. So, short answer, if they are ready to make the Russians pay through inflation, they can finance the war for pretty well.
Yeah.
Effectively, coming back to the Soviet days, it was still the same. They were able to finance the army and the military production through inflation. Of course, officially there was no inflation in the Soviet Union because all the prices remained, stable. But inflation manifested itself by disappearance of goods from the stores. So more or less the same effect.
Mm.
But Putin, as we know, probably because of his experience in the 90s, doesn't like inflation. He's afraid of it, and that's why he trusts Nabiullina to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that sort of chimes with my sense that there is a common assumption amongst certain quarters that Putin is just going through the motions with these negotiations over Ukraine, and he's just trying to sort of play them out, and maybe it's placating Trump and so forth. And I think there's some truth in that. But at the same time, I think that from Putin's point of view, he really does see himself in a position in which he can think, well, either I get what I want, which is something that I can claim as a grand triumph through negotiations. And I think probably if we do see the Ukrainians being forced into surrendering the remaining unconquered part of Donetsk region, for example, and various other concessions, then he will be able to spin it as such. But conversely, if he doesn't, he's perfectly comfortable with the idea of walking away from the talks because he thinks that ultimately he doesn't have to be able to fight a forever war. All he needs to do is to be able to fight longer than Ukraine and primarily its European allies can continue to withstand it. And I think his calculation is that he can, because the Europeans are naturally flighty and they will soon start to think twice as populist political movements arise and the pressure of Ukraine begins to eat into their budgets, that the Ukrainians will naturally eventually get exhausted after maybe, one more very harsh winter with their power system being pummeled by the Russians, etc. I mean, whether or not that's true is another matter, but I think Putin is certainly of the belief that ultimately he can get something that he wants through just simply enduring the current pain in the name of a future victory. And particularly because I think from his point of view, the economic costs are largely manageable, but what they do is, again, we go back to the whole parallel with Soviet times. Remember, this is a man who has seen not one but two authoritarian regimes collapse around him, first East Germany and then the Soviet Union. The main concern is political. And clearly, the economics leads to the political. There's not really any great expectation of directly political protests on any major scale. But on the other hand, there is a sense that actually economic hardship could, in due course, lead to some kind of protest, inchoate, bubbling up from nowhere, which then acquires a political complexion. And I think we're seeing a fair number of moves at the moment which are geared towards precisely preparing not for the necessary expectation that any day now there's going to be public protests, but just simply the possibility thereof. The Rosguardia, the National Guard, getting their own general staff, a whole variety of other moves to essentially try and ensure that if that happens, the state is ready for it in a way that, for example, for different reasons, neither East Germany nor the Soviet Union were actually ready for the protests which emerged. But this also leads to another interesting point, which is what Putin actually thinks about the costs of peace. We have a pretty good sense about what the potential costs of war are, but the costs of peace. Now, sometimes people are saying, oh, well, the Russian economy couldn't cope with an end to the war. I mean, correct me if you disagree, but my sense is that given that Putin will be wanting to reconstitute his military, there will still be the need to keep the defense plants turning. So we're not just talking about a sudden drop off a cliff where suddenly they sort of close down half the production lines at Uralvagon Zavod or whatever. They will be able to stage it. But actually, if one thinks of the political risks of, for example, hundreds of thousands of scarred physically and psychologically veterans returning home, their expectations of a certain set of promises about how life was going to be when they returned home that are almost certainly going to be basically betrayed. And in that context, although I don't think it's a determining factor, I think it's just one small weight on the scales. But nonetheless, from Putin's point of view, war is a known quantity. I mean, I don't think he needs it. He doesn't need it for ideological reasons because he can just simply frame a wider political struggle and economic struggle with Europe to give him the rationale he needs for continued repression and centralization of the system. But at least he knows where he is with the war. There's no real expectation that there's going to be some sudden dramatic reversal. He knows that Ukrainian forces are not going to be crashing towards Moscow. But on the other hand, peace creates all sorts of uncertainties. And this is a man who does not take chances if he can avoid it. This is a man who actually is very risk averse. I mean, I'm not sure, one has to be honest here. I doubt that if Putin had known what he was getting himself into in February of 2022, he would have invaded. He invaded because he thought it was going to be an easy, quick, sure thing, the classic invader's arrogance. So, I mean, in those circumstances, just as if the system is willing to accept, when I say the system, the Kremlin is willing to accept the costs in terms of inflation and the like, yes, it can maintain the economic burden of war for quite some time. So too, I have a suspicion that the political burdens can be maintained for quite some time. And if anything, actually, at least it becomes a known status quo rather than a scary and uncertain sort of new chapter of the story. Anyway, the clock ticks. We've only got a limited amount of time. So I wanted to move on to the third question, which, and again, I'll kick off for you, is so where do we imagine things are going to go? Whether it's 1 year or 4 years or after Putin, whenever that may be, what do you think the future trajectory is likely to be a little bit further over the horizon?
I think that economically, we will see more or less the same, but less shiny. In other words, I would expect the technological gap between Russia and the rest would widen. The overall market will be more dependent on China and more concentrated in itself. This Russia's connection with the world will be limited to oil. I do expect that if there is a peace deal and negotiations with Donald Trump, that the US president would definitely try to open up the Russian market for American goods. And there will be a problem because for many new billionaires who snatched the assets in the past 4 years and snatched the share of the Russian market, which had been dominated by the Europeans, and to do so, just to remind you, they borrowed at 20, 25, or whatever percent. They obviously wouldn't be happy to see American goods flooding the Russian market and depriving them of the NEM monopoly. So those people do not want the story of the 90s to repeat itself when the open borders for the goods effectively killed the whatever was left of the Soviet consumer economy. So it will be a trouble there, and those people will lobby the Kremlin to not open the markets. I believe there will be some inflow of foreign capital, some extremely risk-loving hedge funds will start to invest, but it will be minimal. Otherwise, Russia will remain dependent on China technologically and trade-wise. There is also one thing that I would expect, and I think it's the main danger, which is not discussed enough, is that with the Russian state running out of money, effectively the budget is running out of money, it doesn't have enough funds, and as we discussed at the beginning of our talk, enough bureaucratic power and flexibility to react to whatever unpleasant surprises might wait for Russia down the line. Be it, I don't know, some technological disaster, some natural disasters, I don't know, flood, fires, or even a new COVID or whatever. Russia simply, the government doesn't have enough money and enough power to react to that. And this is, in my view, is the main danger for the Russian economy, and presumably you understand it better for the stability of the political system. Would you agree?
Yes, yes. I think this is, again, we go back to this post-Soviet parallel. On one level, the Soviet system was dying for a long, long time. It could survive in this sort of Schrodinger's neither dead nor alive state. But on the other hand, what could it not deal with? You say, first of all, it was crises. But secondly, of course, it was the attempt to reform itself. And there's always this question of what if? What if instead of a Gorbachev, we had had, for example, an Andropov who wasn't on the verge of dying, or some other younger figure who was actually committed to trying to preserve the system rather than launching some kind of quixotic attempt at change. Clearly, so long as Putin is in the Kremlin, it's highly unlikely we're going to see any meaningful attempt at change. We will just simply see essentially survival adaptation. Afterwards, well, of course, we have no idea of predicting who will be the sort of post-Putin leader. If it's not a transition that is actually overseen by him, I suspect it will be a generational shift down to the 50-something and early 60-something-year-old who are essentially pragmatic kleptocrats. Now, they will not be looking to build some kind of new Sparta, but they might be tempted to think that they can manage some kind of a reform program, which manages to sort of shift Russia away from the Putinist model. And reform is always the hardest and most dangerous thing to manage. That's when authoritarian systems collapse, is when people try to tweak them a little bit. So long as you have ruthless bastards in charge who are willing to imprison or kill whoever gets in their way, unfortunately, those systems have a tendency to survive. And therefore, I think that the interesting point will be precisely whether or not the kind of sort of technocratic survival measures actually are going to prove to be enough. Again, I don't imagine we're going to see collapse and crisis. I think you really have to work hard at making a system collapse catastrophically. Gorbachev certainly sort of deserves credit there. But on the other hand, it is hard, certainly this side of a Putin transition, to see any kind of meaningful improvement in the situation. Instead, and it's not an exciting picture, it's not a dramatic one, we see this slow, shabby decline in which the system can survive, it can hold on, and it can still make some triumphs. And maybe it'll make some progress in international relations and the like, but essentially the fundamentals are not going to be changed. And that creates a challenge for the next generation. But anyway, I'm
The
conscious that
only,
we're almost
yes,
out of
but
time. So
yeah, but the only question is, in the 80s and early 90s, the overall world, be it the Western world or China, were on ascendance. It was an
mm.
enormous growth, economical and technological, both in the States and Europe, in China. Now we are kind of in a different global situation where everyone is, declining a little. So maybe on that background, Russia of tomorrow, as you described it, would not look as unappealing as the Soviet Union looked against the background of the United States, China, and the rest.
Well, that's a glorious closing note, and a very Russian form of optimism, I'd be tempted to say, which is precisely that things will be miserable, but they may well be miserable for everyone else too, which does count as optimism. Anyway, alas, our time is up. Alexander Kolyandr of SIPA and The Bell, and me, Mark Galeotti of In Moscow Shadows. Thanks very much. We just thought we'd throw this out there, just a few thoughts as to where we think things are now and where they're going to be, maybe, perhaps, in the near and distant future. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.